On behalf of the Inter-American Dialogue, CAF Development Bank of Latin America, and the Organization of American States, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Andrea Bernal as the Master of Ceremonies for the 26th Annual CAF Conference. Bernal is a renowned journalist with more than 20 years of experience in radio and television. She has worked at Ecuavisa TV network in Ecuador as an anchor, reporter, and director. Bernal also directed the political opinion and debate program Zoom a la Noticia on the international network NTN 24 and is currently the principal anchor of the Prime News program on Noticias RCN 7 p.m. Bernal was recognized with the Simón Bolívar Award 2018 for the best television interview, and she has moderated various high-level presidential and mayoral debates. Please join me in welcoming Andrea Bernal to the stage.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with all you today. Distinguished panelists and guests, my name is Andrea Bernal. I'm a journalist, I'm a news anchor at RCN Televisión in Colombia. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to the 26th Annual CAF Conference, co-hosted by CAF, Development Bank of Latin America, the Inter-American Dialogue, and the Organization of American States. This year's CAF Conference is a special one, as it marks the first time we have convened in person, finally, since 2019. It is my honor to welcome those attending in person to you all to this beautiful and historic venue, the Wheeler International Intercontinental, which celebrates over 200 years in the nation's capital. We are also pleased to welcome those who are joining us through our live stream on the Dialogues and CAF's YouTube channels. The annual CAF Conference is the preeminent forum in Latin America based here in Washington, D.C. With a 26-year legacy, the CAF Conference addresses the most pressing challenges and opportunities in the hemisphere and reaches tens of thousands of policymakers, experts, civil society leaders, private stakeholders, and fellow Latin Americans such as yourselves every year. Throughout the next 2 days, you can follow Agenda CAF and the dialogue on Twitter for some of the best highlights and also tweets on the conference. So we invite you all to tweet as well with these accounts. We welcome also all of our participants to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag DiálogoCAF 2023. To staff of our 2 days of what promises to be engaging, of course, and lively discussion, I want to introduce and welcome to the stage Rebecca Bill Chavez, President and CEO of the Inter-American Dialogue, Nestor Mendez, Assistant Secretary General of the Organization of American States, and Christian Asinelli, Vice President of Strategic Programming of CAF Development Bank of Latin America, who will each offer welcoming remarks to open the conference. To you all, welcome, and please a round of applause for them.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 2023 CAF Conference. As Andrea mentioned, this is the 26th year that we at the Inter-American Dialogue have co-hosted this conference alongside CAF Development Bank of Latin America and the Organization of American States. For over a quarter of a century, this gathering has brought together regional leaders and other stakeholders invested in the future of our hemisphere. And for over a quarter of a century, the participants and audience at this conference have had a major impact on the future of the Americas. Today, the challenges are significant. This year, we gather at a time when the region is polarized and we're facing a hemisphere-wide migration crisis. COVID-19 has laid bare public health and economic challenges. Democracy is in its second decade of retreat, and climate change is threatening the health and safety of people throughout our hemisphere. So these issues, of course, are at the heart of the dialogue's focus on promoting democratic governance, shared prosperity, and inclusive sustainable growth. They also drive the work of CAF and of the OAS, which is so critically important because today's most pressing challenges to our hemisphere are complex and they transcend national borders. So cooperation is more essential than ever. No single country or organization can address these challenges on their own. Over the next 2 days, we're going to have the opportunity to hear from thought leaders and policymakers, civil society actors, and private sector representatives on these key issues. And I want to close actually by saying how pleased I am to see that so many young people and actually students have registered for this year's conference, both in person, but also a lot online. I want to thank them in particular for being involved, for sharing their voices, for working with CAF, with the OAS and the dialogue, and of course, other organizations, our peer organizations that are here, working to make the hemisphere a better place for all of us. You are the next generation of leaders, and one of my missions as the new president of the dialogue is to empower you to take on that role and move the Americas to more democracy, more inclusion, and more prosperity in the future. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have to go through my little routine these days to adjust the microphone. Most of the time, I have an issue with being vertically challenged, depending on the podium. And the other part of the routine is to check if I need my glasses or not. Since the pandemic now, it's become almost a steady, so much time before the screen. But anyway, it's wonderful to be here. Mr. Christian Asinelli, Corporate Vice President of Strategic Programming of the Development Bank of Latin America, CAF, Mrs. Rebecca Bill Chavez, President of the Inter-American Dialogue, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor to address you on behalf of OAS Secretary General Luis Almagro, who sends his regrets that he is unable to participate in this year's opening due to a prior commitment in the region. This alliance of our three institutions is more than a testament to the unity of purpose that underlies our service to the Americas. It forges our commitment to finding solutions to the multifaceted socioeconomic, political, and fiscal challenges within our global space, and promotes a broad understanding of the main issues that are germane to the Americas agenda. Central to the analysis and the critical thinking which informs strategic planning is the hosting of this annual conference, which gathers thought provokers and decision makers to consider the complex challenges which our region confronts. We are, even in the face of this reality, a region of ideas, of innovation, of creative enterprise, and of the strongest will to overcome. Our history has taught us that every problem is an opportunity to find the solution where it exists, and even to be innovative in creating a solution where it may never have existed. I have a lot of work to do. We coordinate, we strategize, and we collaborate, cognizant that such ideals are given the impetus to bear fruit only through teamwork and consistency of effort. To this end, we must never grow weary of working together to build better and more stable democracies in which our people are afforded the opportunity to realize their fullest potential, enjoy their human rights, and to thrive in secure communities. This is the foundation on which democracy in the Americas is given the might it needs to prevail over dictatorships and the wanton abuse of power. Through our combined effort, democracy as a legacy bequeathed to future generations, one that underpins a more integrated region in which our institutions dispense quality services and in which there is equal access and equitable justice for all. In our time, such ideals must transcend mere rhetoric to become intrinsic elements of our aspirations, our expectations, and our day-to-day routines. With good reason, Secretary General Almagro refers to the Inter-American Democratic Charter as the constitution for the region. It is an insightful and prescriptive living instrument which enshrines the clear objective of nurturing, preserving, and sustaining democracy in the Americas. Without a doubt, it has effectively played a most important role in the defense of democracy in the region. While false international organization at every level, regional governments, the corporate community, the workforce, civil society, and every individual stridently participatory in whose interest democracy stands to deliver on its promise. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot of work to do. We owe it to our people. They're looking forward to it. Thank you.
I'm in the opposite side. I have to take off my glasses. Well, good afternoon to everyone. Buenos días, boa tarde. I would initially like to send a special greeting from our Executive President, Sergio Díaz-Granados, to you all. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce this 26th annual conference in his behalf. I remember our first CAF conference in October 2021 here in DC in a hybrid format. Back then, Sergio talked about our vision. He assured that if CAF didn't transform itself into a green bank, we would be irrelevant as a global and geopolitical actor. This week, for example, he visited Spain. He met the King, Felipe VI, and other authorities from the Spanish government, and he settled all the final details for what is going to be CAF's support to Spain's role as president of the European Union. That is an example of our work toward that vision. Another example of that strategic vision is our Green Bank agenda that has led us to invest 40% of our portfolio in the green financial sector by 2026. And we will keep adapting our organization into a more sustainable, diverse, and inclusive place to improve the life of every citizen in Latin America and the Caribbean. Let me thank the Assistant Secretary General of the Organization American State, Nestor Mendez, and the President and CEO of the Inter-American Dialogue, Rebecca Vilchavez. Our three organizations have worked in this initiative for 26 years now. Thanks to each one of you that is here today, and to every representative of the different sectors of CAF, all of our Vice President, Carolina, Gabriel, and Jorge, él es muy alto, entonces se puso en la parte de atrás, are here in this special occasion. In this 26th edition of our conference, we have a series of sessions, roundtable panels, networkings, and conferences that are aligned with CAF's own working agenda and renewed value proposition. In the 2 days that follow, we will discuss the outcome of the Summit of the America, which took place a few weeks ago in Denver, and where we designed different roadmaps with mayors on the region. Thank you, Nina, that she's here in a few moments. The role of multilateral actor in the fight against climate change, the regional scenario in the post-pandemic area, and global trends such as migration, women, and youth empowerment, and the objective of more inclusive digital economies, among other issues. Sabemos que todas esas brechas que acabo de mencionar todavía.
We know that all those gaps that I've just mentioned are still important in Latin America and the Caribbean, and there are many more gaps that we need to close: social, economic, digital, infrastructure gaps. But social inequality is a gap that occurs generation after generation. That's why our red report was covered inherited inequalities. I invite you all to take a look at this report. For instance, 81% of the children to parents with low education levels reach that same category in their own academic education. And in terms of economic gap, the richest 10% accumulate 77% of the wealth, whereas the poorest 50% accumulates only 1%. LATAM and the Caribbean is also a very unequal region in terms of infrastructure development. The continent has an investment per inhabitant that is equal to 1/3 of the world average, and 3 out of 10 LATAM and Caribbeans live without an internet connection. And the answer to those levels of inequality is only one: cooperation and coordination among social players. Let me introduce the concept that goes around also where social the relationship between and among the main stakeholders, or between economic actors, the public bureaucracy, and citizens and politicians. So all that theoretical system
De la idea de cooperación y del otro término clave que es la coordinación.
cooperation and coordination among strong institutions that can guarantee the system is very important, but also requires consensus that can sustain over time. In the region, we are very much convinced that we have the capacity and the wills that if separate, they wouldn't have any impact. For example, a few days ago, Lula convened all heads of states of South America. They got together for the well-being of the region. That is what Latin America and the Caribbean can do. It has a unique capacity to help solve the problems of the world. And we, as a multilateral organization that was capitalized by its partners with $7 million, we are open to new members, and we fully understand the role in this relationship. We are the agent of development and integration of our member countries, with whom we work without limitations, without imposition of agendas to guarantee growth and development. Our organization has been working for the past 50 years, as you know, coordinating with our social partners, with the initial purpose of integrating Andean countries to the 21 members that we are today. We are a geopolitical player that defends the interests and the values of Latin America and the Caribbean, always looking for the best structural and environmental solutions in the world. We know that things have changed. We know that there is a disruption of the value chains all over the world. The pandemic and other issues have forced us to rethink the region according to its capacities. And in that context, we know that the strategic role that the U.S. has is undeniable and undisputable. From CAF, we've made a joint agenda together with the governments, with universities and other spaces to develop strategic partnerships. A clear example is what we are doing today, now, together with Rebecca and Nestor, together with Inter-American Dialogue and the OAS. Another example is the effort that we have been leading in the event Many Voices, One Region that we had last year for the 77th session of the UN, where leaders and authorities of the continent got together discussing poverty, peace, climate change, and our countries. And together with Sergio Díaz Granados and with CAF team, we think about LATAM and the Caribbean as one single solution to global problems. In terms of agro and food, we are the leading exporting region, and we also have skilled talents, and we are ready to face these challenges. In environmental aspects, we have 1/5 of the world's natural forests. We have the Amazon, one of the most important natural resources, and we have very important global players in the gas transition. In terms of human capital, we have Nobel laureates in literature, peace, science, and unicorns. If we think about LATAM, Caribbean, and the US, 60 million LATAM and Caribbeans live, develop, and add value to the American economy, and many CAF collaborators have also been educated in that country. We think that this is for the benefit and exchange of the two.
That we make today. International leaders, policymakers, investors, multilateral organizations, and entrepreneurs, among many other economic actors, can make singular and important steps toward those goals. Another example of our vision and global work to enhance the voice of our region occurred last week in Rome, where we met Pope Francis and organized a seminar with 50 mayors of Latin America and the Caribbean. It was a breath of fresh air for all those political makers who work near the citizens. As Pope Francis always remembers and reaffirmed in that occasion, no one is saved alone. Nadie se salva solo. Working together in all the different political decision levels is the only path to success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chavez, Assistant Secretary Mendez, and Mr. Asinelli for those inspiring words to launch our 2 days of conference deliberations. I would like to invite Rebecca back, if she wants. Just a little switch, and then Rebecca can come back again to the stage for a dynamic fireside chat on the outcomes and impact of a historic event that many of us in Latin America foreign policy community have been following. And it was the inaugural City Summit of the Americas, which was held in Denver in Colorado from April 26 to 28. This summit convened majors and subnational leaders from across the Western Hemisphere to promote regional cooperation, integration, and innovation. And for this discussion, Dr. Chavez will be joined by Ambassador Nina Hashigian, the first U.S. Special Representative for City and State Diplomacy. In this role, Ambassador Hashigian seeks to bring benefits to and learn also from local leaders in the United States and connect them to counterparts around the world. And she led efforts to convene the City Summits of the Americas. Before rejoining the State Department, Ambassador Hashigian served as First Deputy Major for International Affairs for the city of Los Angeles, where she was instrumental in orchestrating the 9th Summit of the Americas prior to her subnational level work. So I won't talk anymore, and I will read the word to Rebecca so she can introduce, and let's talk about this important event that just happened in Denver.
Thank you. And Nina, it's so great to see you. Thank you for being here. I think I just want to, one thing that Andrea mentioned, and I just want to highlight is Ambassador Hashigian has really informed my thinking, and I think the Dialogue Cities initiative by really highlighting the role of cities and towns as laboratories for solutions to today's global challenges, this idea of local solutions to global challenges. So I want to start out by asking you about the reasoning, the logic behind this first City Summit of the Americas in Denver. How did it come about, and how did you get traction for this sort of event?
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, always delighted to be on a stage or at a restaurant or whatever with you. I want to thank CAF and the OAS and the Dialogue, of course, for having me. And importantly, for all your support for the City Summit. The origin story of the summit happened before I came to the State Department. Brian Nichols, who is in the audience, is someone who might know better than I how it all began. But my understanding was that there had been some folks at the State Department who had been pitching this idea for many years, and that why it particularly gained traction this year, I'm not sure. It may or may not have had anything to do with the fact that they were going to set up a city and state diplomacy, office. But I was there, and you were there in Los Angeles when Secretary Blinken and President Biden announced the city summit back in June. And I think the thinking is this, that we would take the 30,000-foot level commitments that the leaders made, and that Brian and his team were, negotiated on, climate, on clean energy, on the digital transformation, on migration, and bring them down to where the action really happens at the local level. And so the State Department teamed up with Denver and an NGO called the Biennial of the Americas. And it was really a team effort. I was saying to Brian earlier of his team and my team that worked so hard to kind of pull this all off. And we had about 2,500 participants, 250 mayors, lots of other city officials, representatives of these global networks that cities are part of, indigenous leaders, youth, civil society, private sector, and as you said, the kind of slogan, the theme was global challenges, local solutions. So I think it's fair to say the State Department has never done anything like that before. I think it was the first city summit that the State Department co-hosted, really in any region, and yeah, it was something special.
It was, and it was actually, well, actually, let me ask you a question about the goals of the summit. Did it accomplish what you set out to do?
Yeah, there were, I think, a bunch of different kinds of goals that we had. So, it was about pushing implementation of these leader-level commitments, and mayors are the most pragmatic kind of problem-solving people that you'll ever meet. And we had, 100 or so sessions on all the different topics that the leaders had talked about, but also, other topics that mayors really wanted to talk about, including, housing and women's empowerment and a number of others. And so you could see, if you were paying attention, that best practices were being shared, and you could see one mayor saying to another mayor, well, I want to come to your city and see that thing that you're doing that's so interesting and different. So we may not know what all those connections end up being, but I'm pretty convinced that there were a lot of them generated. Another goal of mine was to bring all these city networks together, because they've never been in one place at one time. So we have networks for climate and networks for migration and countering extremist violence and a whole bunch of others, and they were all in Denver, and that in and of itself was really interesting for them and worthwhile. And then it was also for me about the mayors and about lifting up the work that they do and recognizing the work that they do, which doesn't happen very often, for them. Certainly not when it comes to their work on international challenges, and they do that every day. But we got a lot of really positive feedback from them after the summit. They, called it like a major step forward and a fundamental shift. And journalists also were really complimentary in ways that I was kind of shocked by. And the other thing that I thought was, I don't think I necessarily anticipated, but it's interesting, like the folks at the State Department and mayors are thinking about the same challenges a lot of the time. They're thinking about COVID, and they're thinking about cybersecurity, and they're thinking about climate change, but they are not often connected in their actual action. So to see that interaction happening and the kind of delight of State Department people in talking to these folks who are so pragmatic was exciting.
One of the things that I noted too is so often, I think from the United States, when we look at Latin America and the Caribbean, we see it, there's this narrative of almost negativity. One of when you were talking about the networks, is that it was a real chance to see that a lot of the solutions to challenges that mayors in the U.S. are facing, the ideas that are coming from Latin America and the Caribbean, are providing these best practices that we in the United States can really learn from. And that you mentioned that there were a lot of different topics, including the climate crisis. But I know for the sake of time, I want to ask you about one in particular, and this is something that when we were in Los Angeles with CAF also, and that we had a panel on how mayors are addressing migration, in particular kind of with the growing xenophobia. What are mayors and what are local governments doing to integrate migrants? And I was wondering if you could share any takeaways that you have on that particular topic.
Yeah. It's one that comes up a lot, obviously at the city summit itself, but also just in my conversations with mayors. And cities are really on the front lines in the sense that they have to be the ones to settle the migrants that are coming to their cities, and they have a lot of control over how they're perceived and how they get integrated. And I know that the Truman Center led a session where local leaders, discussed how they can collaborate and how they can learn from each other. And we had a couple of other sessions on it as well. The one that the Secretary of State raises frequently is when he went to Bogota and learned there about a migrant center that Mayor Lopez has implemented, centers, I should say, where the new Bogotans, as she calls them, mostly refugees from Venezuela, come to get kind of a one-stop shop for their legal needs and their employment needs and their, whatever other childcare needs, et cetera. So that is a topic that lends itself, there's obviously the national level discussion, but in terms of the humans and the how to bring them into society, that's really a function of cities. And I've spoken to a number. I know it's challenging in some places in the United States, but I've spoken to a number of mayors who are really happy to have refugees come to their cities, that is a way to increase their populations, that there is sometimes employment that others don't want to do that they're able to do. So yeah.
Yeah, that was something, a takeaway that I had too, was the way that mayors are sometimes really kind of taking the initiative on changing the narrative and talking about how migration can be very positive to the local community. It's not negative. So one other topic, so we were together on a session that was actually focused on women's economic empowerment, and Claudia Lopez was at that session too. And Ambassador Hichigian has been a real champion for women throughout her career, including your role on the Leadership Council, Women in National Security. But I was wondering, what about that particular topic, women's economic empowerment, what's happening at the local level to bring women in, to empower them, and even if you could talk a little bit about the whole digital inclusion piece.
Yeah. Well, this was really, a session hosted by you, and I was really, so pleased to help kick it off. The part that I saw was a really excellent conversation amongst a very large variety of very diverse set of voices around the table on how important economically it is to bring women in, the various ways that a city can really think about how to take care of caregivers in a way that they can then educate themselves, can take on employment, et cetera. Really powerful. And then, we had a roundtable with Secretary Blinken as well with women mayors, 5 women mayors from Bogota, Fremont, California, Santo Domingo, Tucson, and Wausau that he was really taken with. It was really a conversation about the challenges they faced as the first women leaders in all but one of those places, and how they're all the different creative ways in which they're advancing women's empowerment in their cities.
That just reminds me, I was in Santiago with CAF, and I learned they had a conference of women mayors, that only 16% of mayors are women in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I'm so glad that Secretary Blinken was there for that. So I guess my final question is on what's next. So we had this great conference, all of these top, we saw these nascent networks of mayors forming. What's next? How do we carry this forward?
So I think the big goal is that I think we'd like to see this not be the only one, and that that eventually it becomes part of the summit process, the way other kinds of summits have. But we signed a bunch. We have a bunch of particular declarations that mayors sign that they will be taking forward. There was the Denver Declaration, which had outlined certain kinds of priorities from the local leaders. The mayor of Rio launched the Anti-Racist City Network and the Anti-Racist Cities Pact, and that's kind of expanding on the work of Brazilian cities to others. We launched Cities Forward, which is a sustainable climate initiative, and so that work will go forward with 24 cities sharing their best practices on sustainable solutions and inclusion. And I hope that the connections made will sustain and will continue to grow, and we will be following up to see that is the case, and lending our help in whatever way that we can. We did a survey of participants afterwards, and some over 80%, it may have been 90%, think that we should have another one of these within 2 years. We gave them a choice of years, and that's what they said. So a lot of different pieces to follow up on, and it's what my observation has been working with mayors in the past is they go off and tend to just keep connecting with each other and learning from each other. When they see something that's interesting, they take it, and they're very happy. They're very happy to share ideas with each other. There's not really pride of authorship. Usually the pride is in if someone else copies my idea. So.
Thank you. Actually, I have a couple minutes left, it looks like, so I'm going to use it. So that just, the idea, I was wondering if you could describe when you were talking about this network, and I'm kind of, because I saw it, and I think that the connections between U.S. and Latin American mayors, if there are any particular examples you could give on any of these topics.
Yeah, I can talk about some that, I saw, if you're talking about at the city summit, I saw mayors talking to each other about how they're, planning to go visit that city that, these ideas have come up in. I know that the Bloomberg Network, which is about use of data in governance and how to better governance, using data is expanding in Latin America, and they started with the United States. So that's a network that will continue to, pull people together. There's a big network called UCLG, United Cities and Local Government. It's based in Barcelona, Spain. I don't think are any American U.S. cities that are members of it, but hopefully that will change over time. But they are very they've got a lot of Latin American members. There are climate networks as well, C40 and ICLEI, that include U.S. and Latin American cities. The Cities Forward initiative will likely turn into its own kind of mini network where cities will stay in touch about sharing their ideas. So those are some of the ones, and then of course the Brazilian anti-racist network as well as it gets off the ground. I'm sure will include USN.
Yeah.
Well, American cities.
Thank you so much, Nina, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing what comes. You have an amazing team, and I'm sure we're going to be following, and hopefully this will go to another region.
Hope so. We'll see.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador and Rebecca, for leading such a fascinating conversation about cities, learning from cities and knowing how different we are, but how we have in common so many cities in our continent. Distinguished guests, please let us have your attention at the first full-length session that is about to begin. After 3 years that left the world a very different place than it was before, our prominent panelists will discuss not only how the pandemic affected healthcare systems in Latin America, but the follow-through on policy commitments to improve them. Our experts will give recommendations on how the region can best prepare itself for future global health crisis. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our first session, Pablo Bartol. Pablo is the Manager of Social Development for CAF Development Bank of Latin America, after previously serving as Minister of Social Development for Uruguay under the administration of President Luis Lacalle Pou. Without further, please join me in welcoming Pablo, and he will introduce his panelists.
Buenas tardes a todos. La verdad que un placer estar aquí.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in this CAF conference, leading such a distinguished panel at this historical place. This morning, I read that in 1861, Abraham Lincoln, after being elected, was refuged for almost a week for life threats until he took office. So this gives us a sense of history and learning about the pandemic with more of a historical sense, looking at it as a time in life, if we could look at Abraham Lincoln's life. And the topic in our panel is whether we are prepared for the next pandemic. When thinking about this and thinking about this drastic and historical terms, you could say we are prepared for the next pandemic. Chun, 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 chun. So anyway, we'll try to give it a less drastic but realistic character to the reality of the pandemic and the scars that have remained and how we will prepare in Latin America. And the question is kind of rhetoric. We know that we are not prepared. We know that the serious consequences of the pandemic have hit as a society, not only in terms of health, but also in terms of development. And it caused 7 million deaths in the region, reported by the WHO, though the general director estimated almost 20 million people who died in our region and the world. So I think that for all of us, it's really important to think about this, thinking about the future, and thinking about how we will be prepared for a similar situation in the future. We have a very distinguished panel with the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Brian Nichols. Mr. Nichols, he works at the U.S. Department of State. He was previously ambassador of the U.S. at the Republic of Zimbabwe. from 2018 to 2021, where he promoted democracy, the rule of law, and human rights in that country while managing humanitarian crisis caused by corruption, climate change, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Previously, the Assistant Secretary was Ambassador of the U.S. in Peru from 2014 to 2017, though he has long roots with Latin America. Also, he was appointed in Latin America several years ago. So thank you very much, Mr. Nichols. Then we have Beatriz Londoño. She's a physician and former Minister of Health and Social Protection in Colombia in Manuel Santos' administration. After that, he worked as ambassador of Colombia in Switzerland, where she represented the country before the WTO. She had several positions. She worked very much on that. And we have Felicia Knoll, director of the Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas. She's worked for more than 3 decades to promote world health, focus on the reduction of inequalities and improvement of the situation of vulnerable groups, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean. At the University of Miami, she works as a professor, Leonard Miller, director of the Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas, as I said before, and head member of the program for cancer control. So we will now have a conversation. We'll have a general question for the three of you, and then specific questions for each one of you, and then we'll open it up for the rest of the audience. So the pandemic has brought about many inequalities and has reflected that inequalities mentioned by our President Cristina Sinelli that were already present in the region. And it has affected us due to the lack of reaction. The health systems reflect this unfortunate situation of our region. The WHO recommends that countries should invest at least 6% of the GDP in health, but very few countries are able to reach those values. When we compare it with the OECD countries, we see that the region insufficiently invests in the region. So my question is, the pandemic with the deep impacts in all levels of life, was it able to raise awareness in people, institutions, and change this situation for the region? Mr. Nichols? Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you. The pandemic has reflected a reality that we always knew, that inequality, lack of access to health services, the differences between urban and rural areas represented a serious threat to our region. What we have learned from that is that we need to look for a way to close those gaps as soon as we can. We cannot walk towards a future where if you don't live in a capital city, then you will not have access to the quality of health that is required. If you don't have oxygen in your hometown, then you will die. The question of whether we are prepared for another pandemic or not, well, that also depends on what type of pandemic. The nature of the disease will also have an important impact. If it were an Ebola type of disease, a respiratory tract disease, then we are in serious trouble to respond promptly. as would be needed. If this is something that develops in a more slower manner, then we will have more time to react. And I think that we have moved forward quite a bit. I think that we've started with more training for the medical community, more transparency in health sectors, more production in our region for all the supplies that are needed for the next pandemic. We but there's a lot much to be done in the US. As an administration, we have donated over 70 million vaccines to the region. We are producing the antibiotic pills to control COVID, and that could also be replicated in a future pandemic if we have the time to be prepared for it. And that pandemic could also happen in somewhere else in the world. If it comes from Asia again, then we would have time to get ready. But if this future pandemic comes from our own region, then we won't. We need to be more agile. We need to be smarter to face that huge challenge.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I believe that when we talk about getting prepared for a pandemic, we can not only think about health. This should be an intergovernmental and intragovernmental preparation together with international organizations and civil society organizations. Otherwise, we would repeat the story with profound inequalities, impact on women and children, and the lack of school attendance. So when we think about sectors in healthcare, it's important to consider the need to turn data into information. So it's a huge learning. Second, we need to believe in science and we need to work to avoid misinformation. Third, coordination. Coordination should not only occur in times of emergency. Coordination should be built through a systematic effort, transparent efforts that coordinate not just the levels of government in a country, but it should be a non-ideologized dialogue or conversation in order to move forward. And finally, in this resilience that we need on the part of healthcare systems, something that the multilateral banks and WHO have emphasized, this is an effort and a focus not only on equipment, physical equipment, but a consistent preparation of the healthcare professionals and also the work with the governments, with the private sector, and engagement of subnational levels. And I emphasize this. Thank you, Beatriz. Felicia. Our region has been one of the most innovative regions in terms of health care in the world. And despite that, during the pandemic, we saw the logics of these reforms and the weaknesses of healthcare systems. As you mentioned very well, underfunded systems and the huge size of the healthcare sector as an economic sector. So the fact that healthcare systems are underfunded. Third, we need to address the inequalities that healthcare systems should be pushing towards a reduction of inequality, a reduction of poverty, but we see it the other way around, unfortunately, making poverty and inequality worse in our countries. When we think about the healthcare economy, For the past decades, we know that the return on investment in health is one of the most important that we can have of all sectors. However, our systems still have a vicious circle. Worse investment or lower investment create higher inequalities and higher poverty. But we do have an opportunity to turn it around. And this is what we used to say before the pandemic. And the pandemic showed that we do have this possibility towards a virtuous cycle where health investments can cause greater economic growth, can reduce inequalities, and can help reduce poverty. However, we still have these little resilient systems and a series of examples in the region that despite having gone through innovative reforms, we witness the destruction of key institutions, both in health systems as well as in social systems. I must say that most of the countries in the region during the pandemic were very much reliant on the anti-poverty transfer programs, except for some countries, particularly in Mexico, where we saw the closing of a series of institutions at the worst time. I think this should be a lesson learned. We should never think about destroying our institutions. We should think about reforming. But the worst time to think about shutting down an institution is when you are facing a challenge and a crisis, as was the pandemic. Thank you very much. I would like to ask Mr. Nichols about international cooperation. We all know that one of the challenges during the pandemic was the lack of vaccines and masks and ventilators. On top of that, the limited tech capacity of the region to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines. In your opinion, what can we do at present to overcome these challenges in the future, and how the countries of the Americas should cooperate to reduce the tech gaps and be better prepared in case of a new pandemic? This is a very good question. Of course, we need to do many things. We have already seen growth and transfer of production towards the Americas, and that is very important, of course. We do have more production capacity, manufacturing masks, for instance, and manufacturing all medical supplies that are needed. I believe that the pharmaceutical companies have also invested more money in our regions. There are countries with an important presence of American companies, such as in Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Costa Rica, that can produce pharmaceutical products and vaccines in the future. And one of the important things is to create a collaborative network, a knowledge network to respond in case of an emergency. We in the United States also need to increase our production capacity and work from the country to the rest of the world. The worst case scenario is when there is a crisis and vaccines are not shared or drugs are not shared. So it is very important to be able to collaborate in that regard. I want to emphasize also that the exchanges that we need should also happen before a crisis. Now is the time to collaborate. That is why, For example, after the COVID pandemic, Secretary Blinken created a network of foreign affairs ministers to coordinate political decisions. And now there is a system in place of coordination among the health ministers of our region. But we also need to finance the crisis by working hand in hand with the financial institutions at international level, and not just in the Americas, but globally. So, all along this process, we also need to improve communication through media and social media. We need to move forward understanding what people should do or should not do. We know that based on the previous pandemic, there was a lack of clarity in social communication to the people. Of course, it is complicated for them. It's also complex for the experts whenever the information must be announced, but it's also key to keep up the trust in the process. Thank you. Beatriz, my question is to you from your international experience. You were, well, as a minister in particular, as a Minister of Health. Well, international cooperation was in general a failure. In general, not even within regional blocs, cooperation was clear. Nationalisms imposed and inequality in access to services was a stamp, unfortunately, even with central countries in piracy. Second, as we said before and now is ratified by Mr. Nichols, cooperation must be built based on trust, based on clarity, and exchange of information. And if you allow me, Pablo, regional blocs, for instance, in the region, CARICOM and SIGA, the economies that were less developed were the ones that had a better response, technical response and practical response to their populations, to ensure common practices, to establish rules of the game, and make also centralized procurement. And of course, there are disparities when strong economies enter the process of denial in the pandemic. So cooperation should not only occur for health, it should go beyond. It should be part of trade, to facilitate trade, agriculture, the sustainable goals in the long term, in the mid-term. Climate change goals were absolutely left aside when in fact they had to also be addressed. Because at that time we didn't know the impact, the true impact of the pandemic that maybe today we know. Of course, in retrospective is an exact science, as we know, but this is a collective lesson learned. Thank you, Beatriz. Felicia. Not long ago, we had a discussion with you. You talked about endemics in order to explain this process. My question is, why do you think that what we saw in the past years was a syndemic? In your perspective, what are the implications of adopting such a view?
The idea of the syndemia or syndemic I think was crucially important to understanding what we need to think about in terms of future pandemic preparedness. And it speaks to a little bit of what Beatriz was saying in the first round of questions. The syndemic is the idea of layered pandemics: violence, gender inequity, non-communicable diseases, poverty. The pandemic, the disease COVID-19, seeped into every crack that we saw in every system in every country. So pandemic preparedness is actually about having strong anti-poverty programs, about having feminist policy, about having an effective response to non-communicable diseases, about working on eradicating violence, because that is where we saw the multiple layers of the pandemic. The other piece that I wanted to focus on when we think about a syndemic is a little bit, it comes out of some of our recent research, is that there was a lack of national policy making or cohesive national policy making in most of the countries in the region. National stewardship was lacking. What happened was a kind of punt politics, and that's what we've written about. National governments, particularly Mexico and Brazil, punted to state governments with no cohesive indication of how they had to respond to the pandemic itself and to the disease. Yet we realized that there were a series of responses that were required at the subnational level that had to be coordinated in a way that they were not. And I think that we forgot, and we need to think about in the next round, whatever this crisis is, that in addition to national stewardship, we have to realize that we have subnational units, be they states, be they cities, local governments, that have to play a key role. The third point in this syndemic that I want to focus on is the idea of gender. And I know there's going to be a session about this tomorrow, but what I usually like to say is, la neta, when we think about the health sector, is that it's produced by women, 70% of the hours, 70% of the people, 70% of the value, and we're talking about 11% of global GDP, according to our most recent estimates, are produced by women. Yet the decision makers and the leaders in our educational institutions that produce the people that work in the health sector and of the health sector itself are overwhelmingly men. And we know from economics and many other kinds of science that diversity is the key to unlocking innovation and growth. So this global constant of misusing and underutilizing the time, particularly of women in the health sector, was a terrible problem that we can fix. We saw people dying without access to doctors and dying without access to nurses and dying without access to support when we had millions of trained healthcare providers who were women who had no access to work. So you had an unused labor force. It is still there, and it's underutilized for a series of reasons that have to do with having a more thoughtful, feminist set of policies in the health sector and beyond. And so I think that's the other area of the syndemic that we really need to think about going forward.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Knoll. La verdad que muchas gracias también por contestar en
Thank
inglés.
you very much, and thank you for answering in English to combine the blend of this session between English and Spanish. My accent is better in English. And this formality and informality, right, that we have in Latin America of calling ourselves by the first name or the last name. So I'm going to call you Brian now, okay? So that we go from formal into informal. So let's go back to a general question. This event, as you know, is organized by CAF together with Dialogue, and we are very much interested in knowing what task should we undertake. So the question to all of you, what is your experience, or based on your experience, rather, what is the role for development actors, multilateral banks, to prepare the region for the next pandemic? What would be your 3 tips, Brian?
So we continue this plan.
Now that I know I'm allowed to do that. really important question. So the three things that, well, one, let me talk about my role, which I think it's crucial to continue to build political will across our hemisphere to prepare and act to address the weaknesses of the that have already been discussed in this panel. Whether it's access to education, greater gender equality in the healthcare sector, more transparent financing. We have to continue to build the political will to do that. And one of the challenges with regard to any crisis that's going to require preparation and planning is that people lose interest. We have a short-term memory, and then we decide, oh, well, we can't really spend money on this because we have competing demands. The first thing that I think multilateral development banks and international financial institutions can do is to provide a long-term vision and to have conversations with government about what is the economic implication, how is your plan for growth affected by these black swan events of a pandemic. And given the challenge of climate change and greater migratory patterns in our hemisphere, in our world, it may be that this black swan event is actually an every 10 years event. So that's the first thing, long-term vision. Second thing, ensuring that there is proper financing for the key areas and gaps that the countries in our region need, whether it's rural healthcare expansion, whether it's digital inclusion, whether it's resilience in the educational system. We haven't talked much about the pandemic's effect on education, but in our hemisphere, children lost at least 2 years of education, I think, in every country in the hemisphere, and that is tragic. The third thing that I think is crucial is for international financial institutions to provide the technical expertise so that countries understand the risks that they are facing. As I think as a baseline, many countries do not have the wherewithal to analyze what specific weakness they have and in order to do the other things that I mentioned.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nichols. ¿Y Beatriz?
Yo cuando preguntas por consejos de oro, yo diría que
When you ask about golden advice, I think that for preparing to a pandemic, it should be rhodium because it's more valuable in the market than gold itself. But I think that development agencies such as banks, clearly the first thing that they need to do is to be intercoordinated. Many years ago, I had to coordinate the first joint mission of the IDB for the World Bank when I was at the National Department of Planning in Colombia. And it was very interesting to see the difficulties in their own coordination, even being on the field. But clearly, there was a common language, there were common goals, and we were able to develop a working plan at that time that I believe was illustrative for the country, but also for bank agents. The second point in terms of coordination means that country assessments should be joint because there are needs that are being shared, because there are priorities that are government priorities, but those that go beyond the different government terms and the times for credits of banks or development agencies vary. They don't need to be precarious in the chronological adjustment to specific governments. So second, I believe that the health momentum, just as it was as important and it was a priority, it's now over. And this is a paradox because we need to resume it, as was clearly said, in order to ensure a capability generation in the region for self-supply in terms of vaccines and tests and all of that. That means we need to consolidate national health healthcare institutes. This also means, and I go back, training, quality training for healthcare providers, also increase or improve the redistribution of healthcare professionals. But clearly, the bank and development agencies cannot be restricted to specific projects, to small projects, to support the construction of hospitals here or improving something else over there. They need to be ambitious, and let me highlight this. They need to be ambitious and also set restrictions when you give credit lines in order to make sure that there is a regular revision of the capacity and preparation of countries before a new pandemic. And last, very clearly also, here, CAF and the dialogue, the host years, but CAF was the bank that gave the greatest amount of credits and supported with resources, even over the IDB and the World Bank and other agencies. And this is remarkable. I think that we need to highlight this. And to conclude, let me say that I believe that the bank needs, and I say this with a lot of respect, some humbleness to be critical in terms of their governance, their internal organization, the flexibility they need to have so that their important support when you need anti-cyclical resources do not leave aside the middle and long-term development. But as I was saying, we need political will, we need consistency, coherence, the appraisal of the technical aspect above any political consideration of various countries, and also a guarantee that if we don't do this, we will have some other resources from the eastern side, even though they are now lower, and I mean the flow of resources of Asian banks or China itself, that could even displace what the multilateral bank or the regional or sub-regional banks have strengthened today in the last 3 years in the region. Thank you very much, Ambassador Londoño. I will tell our president, Sergio Díaz Granados, to appoint you as CAF president also because of all the things that you've just said. But I mean, figures speak for themselves, yeah. But I would like to appreciate your remarks because we're really very proud of being able to respond this way before such a difficult task as is saving life. Felicia? Yes, we go from informal to formal. Today, previously I said Felicia, now I say Dr. Knoll. Okay, four suggestions very quickly. For CAF, that as Beatriz was saying, has invested so much in these countries, in our countries. One is science of implementation. We need to know what worked and what did not work. And that requires evidence, requires data, and it also requires money investment. Second, investing in intersectorial programs when we think about the next pandemic. And we have a lot of evidence that of what works and what does not work. So I think that we can invest there in programs against poverty. Three, invest in equality and also gender equality specifically, and also consider how important the healthcare sector is. This is where we have no payment, no recognition, but where we can achieve a lot in terms of health. And finally, what we've seen at a subnational level, I believe that an area of opportunity for multilateral banks is to open channels for loans and technical support at a subnational level. In general, this is not done. This is done at a national level. And when we have a failed government, that leaves you with no possibility of knowing when you have many opportunities at a subnational level, and it does not allow you to achieve what you are searching for, at least in a specific scale. Thank you very much, Felicia. We also have a wonderful panel, so we want to open it up during 10 minutes for Q&A. If you want to make questions or comments to this very experienced panelist, you have to move to the front to the microphones.
What has happened to the production within Latin America of mRNA vaccines? And how will, Mr. Ambassador, the U.S. reform Doha and TRIPS to enable vaccine production within Latin America and also within Africa?
So first thing I would say is there is a growing capacity for pharmaceutical and vaccine production in our hemisphere, but it is not sufficient yet. We believe that there should be negotiated processes for licensing production of vaccines or other pharmaceutical products between private sector and countries around the world. The United States, in addition to having donated, as I said, over $70 million 70 million doses of vaccines in our hemisphere, we also provided over $600 million in COVID-19 assistance to this region. I think the intelligent way forward is to make sure that governments around our hemisphere and societies are better able to respond themselves. So building that capacity for production and development in advance is something that's important, but that has to come within the context of supporting policies that are going to make private sector investment in health and in pharmaceuticals viable and successful throughout our hemisphere.
Hey, hello. My name is Alejandra. I'm a reporter for EFE, Spanish news agency. Yeah, I'm too short.
You're the right height.
You are. I totally agree.
I have a couple of questions for Mr. Nichols. The first one is the U.S. is sending military to Peru. Why this decision in a moment that when the military and the police in Peru is being questioned by the excessive use of force in the protests? And then the second question is, former prosecutors from Guatemala have claimed that there is not an environment for free elections in the country that are coming up, given the prosecution of the judicial force in the country. So my question would be, does the US think there is an environment for free elections in Guatemala? Thank you so much.
So these are a little off topic.
Just a little.
But I'll talk a little bit about Peru, because I think it is relevant. One of the things that the United States does that I am most proud of is our humanitarian assistance and disaster relief cooperation with militaries and civilian authorities around the Americas. And some of the things that we have done, like in Peru, when I was ambassador to Peru, we helped Peruvian military and civil authorities prepare for earthquakes, prepare for floods, prepare for infectious disease outbreaks. Those collaborations happened in different parts of the country, north, south, interior, coast, mountains, valleys, and I think that helped Peru, and similar programs around our hemisphere have helped both civilian and military forces prepare for rare but catastrophic events. And when we do training and cooperation, those with whom we train are always vetted for human rights compliance and concerns, and we embed human rights training into all of the things that we do in terms of military cooperation. In terms of elections in Guatemala, I think it's very important that the international community observe the electoral process from beginning to end in Guatemala, as it does throughout the hemisphere, including in the United States. And then we will have a comprehensive report, probably from multiple organizations, about how the process has developed, what's working and what's not. I note that we have colleagues from the Organization of American States here, and they've participated in that process in many different countries, not to mention the European Union, Carter Center, so many other groups, and their role is vital to that process.
Muchas gracias. Una última pregunta de este lado.
Thank you very much. One last question from this side.
To ask the panelists, how advanced scientifically and technically countries in Western Hemisphere so as to produce vaccines in partnerships with other companies or pharmaceutical companies globally? What can you offer?
You're gonna throw that one to me. I agree completely with the second that there is a tremendous capacity in our region in terms of the pharmaceutical sector to be able to undertake production. And we've seen that in many countries in the region in a number of areas that are key. Second, there are some very interesting, I think, financing innovations and platforms that we call innovative financing that exist in our region. We can criticize parts, we cannot criticize parts, but the bottom line is when you think about what the Pan American Health Organization has done for financing vaccines, for setting up the strategic fund, which is largely focused on non-communicable disease medicines. What it does is allow smaller countries to enter in a much fairer playing field in terms of accessing and being able to be part of what is a regional or global set of solutions. What we also, I think, see, and I don't want to go too much into global health policy making, is a lot of the global initiatives to be able to produce vaccines were tremendously unsuccessful in our region and otherwise. And that's a whole area of analysis for what is pandemic preparedness. And while it's key, I would keep going back to the idea of this endemic, that the vaccines are key. But if people can't get to the vaccines, if people don't have enough to eat, and if people don't have work, the vaccine is going to have limited effect.
Thank you very much, Dr. Noel. And now for the closing words, I would like Ambassador Nichols. We are all here. We know the high responsibilities you have in the United States and looking for Latin America. So we would like some remarks you would like to give us.
Well, I see this dear lady here who hasn't had an opportunity to ask her question. I know they're holding up the sign. This is 3 minutes. 10-second question.
Go on.
Is it on? Okay, my name is Dr. Myrtle Alexander, Institute for Academic Management. I heard reference to the next pandemic repeatedly. Should we be prepared? Is there another pandemic that's on the horizon? That's my question.
I've been asked that one. Even if there isn't a pandemic, we should be prepared because it's the best thing you can do to be able to generate economic growth, more equity, and less poverty.
And your final words, please.
Well, that was a great answer. And I think, again, we need to work comprehensively to close the economic disconnects and dislocations in our hemisphere. We need to close the breaches between urban and rural populations. We need to close the educational gap in our hemisphere. Those are all things that will serve us well, whatever the future holds. Even if there's not a pandemic in the near term, and it truly is a 100-year pandemic, and I think we now understand that the 1918 flu was really a very similar type of pandemic to the one we just went through. So if every 100 years we have that, let's make sure that we're taking advantage of that gap in time to be as prepared for all of the challenges and all of the shocks. Because if it's not an infectious disease pandemic, we're going to have challenges with climate change, with lifestyle diseases that will all be better served by taking the same preparatory steps as we would to prepare for a pandemic.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Ambassador Nichols, Ambassador Londoño, and Dr. Knowles, Felicia. Thank you very much, and we thank you all these comments you have done on this issue we have now, how we prepare for next pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Gracias, diputado.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you for all the panelists. One of the wonderful things about being back and in person is we have carved out time to reconnect with old friends and make connections with the new ones. Well, we are going to take a break until it's 4:15, the break that we're going to take, yeah? For you to get many other wonderful Latin Americans in the room and enjoy some refreshments. Don't forget to check the hashtag Diálogo CAF 2023. And please join me back in this ballroom for 15 for another fascinating fireside chat with the top-level United States official Juan Gonzalez and renowned journalist Gabriela Frias. So I expect you back at 4:15. Thank you. Attention, please. We will begin with the next session in 5 minutes. Please take your seats. Thank you. Un llamado, por favor. Vamos a comenzar con la próxima sesión de hoy en unos 5 minutos. Por favor, tomar sus asientos. Muchas gracias. I invite everyone to take their seats. We're going to start. Thank you very much. I hope you are all back feeling refreshed for the rest of our afternoon. And if you're not, you'll certainly be after this discussion with Juan Gonzalez. He's a special assistant to the President of the United States and National Security Council Director for the Western Hemisphere. Juan has made his mark as a leader in Latin America foreign policy, previously serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere and a special advisor to the then Vice President Biden. We are honored to have him here to give us insider insights into the NSC's engagement on Latin America and priorities of the Biden-Harris administration for Latin American foreign policy. Joining to moderate is someone who needs no introduction, a dear colleague, Gabriela Frias, business anchor for CNN en Español and host of En Efectivo. Gabriela's long and prolific career as a journalist and producer has spanned the intersection of public policy, finance, and economics in the region. Please join me in welcoming Gabriela Frias and Juan Gonzalez to the stage.
Gracias, Andrea, Juan. Hello, good afternoon to you all. ¿Cómo estás? We're going to speak in Spanish. I thought it would be better. Qué gusto.
Igual, Gabriela.
Encantada
It's a pleasure. Nice to have you here. And I must tell you that as a Mexican and Latin American journalist, I'm going to get you out of the Washington bubble where you preach to the converted kind of thing. It is great to be here to talk about things that I have from the region. So, Juan, I was told to ask you so many things when they knew I was going to be the moderator. I was told to do so many things. So, if we think about what we've done in the previous days, I am tempted to ask you about what we've seen in Brasilia in relation to the speeches that we've heard about Jay Sullivan, in relation to the American strategy towards China, and how we connected this foreign policy with the Latin American policy. You talk about human rights, free elections, democratic elections. And what happened with the last event when you hear President Lula, for instance, an important partner to the region, talk about a narrative in relation to the past years in Venezuela and a narrative from the West? Were you surprised at that characterization? Well, first of all, let me thank you. And just as I told you before, I admire so many journalists, including Jorge Ramos, but whenever I hear your voice on television, I stop by and I like to hear what you say. You always address very important economic issues, which I believe are a benefit to everyone. Now, instead of telling you how I reacted myself, what impacted me the most was what President Lacalle and Gabriel Boric said. A center-right president, another a center-left president, who show a contrast in the international political way, but also in the domestic way of how democracies have certain roles and responsibilities. And much of what Boric has done, I believe, were projects and conversations which are very hard nationally to encompass, but the result of those conversations reinforce democracies in Chile or in Uruguay, countries that have such a tradition. So in terms of the American and Brazilian policy, we know ever since the times of President Obama that support is not given in any context. And I'm not going to tell you what President Lula might be thinking about, but in those topics, whether we need to use nations as a tool. So are the discussions, are policies the mechanism to use particularly to support those who have an interest in changing what happens in Venezuela. So that is our focus. We really want to take part. Now, rather than thinking about a fight, I believe that citizens ask themselves, what about human rights? It shouldn't be a black or white under the Biden administration. And they also wonder, wouldn't it be good to support the presidents who coincide with the fundamental values that are promoted and that you also promoted in your plans and discussions lately? I believe that the right and the left both are in line with a selective morale, how we support these topics in a way that there should be complete results in the defense. And this is how you characterize it publicly.
En Twitter o en la televisión.
So if you fight for human rights in Twitter and on TV, you may have some contexts. So journalists who are being attacked, and journalists and judges also, sometimes you need to take public positions on some aspects. On other aspects, you need to do it in a strategic manner so that the US is not distracted from those debates that must be conducted in the US. Conversations in Mexico, Colombia, or Brazil that are also important. But to your question, whether we need to support those leaders publicly, a piece of criticism that we have is that sometimes we spend more time in challenging countries, and the reality is that Latin America is a complicated region in times of global changes. And so if we are going to navigate those waters, we need to find a way, particularly with the bigger economies, and advance in strategic matters with North America. And then the disruptions, the global interruptions should not distract us from our national matters. I assume that you are not thinking about a president with whom you're going to have more differences than coincidences. By the way, you've been for more than one decade, making an effort to make ends meet with Venezuela. So, well, in terms of Venezuela, we have strong understandings and misunderstandings in countries like Brazil. Brazil is a bridge with the G77. Brazil is a country for which other countries like China and Russia are trying to make it choose one side. And while we manage this agreement, we need to find points of understanding in defense, in the industries, also in climate change and others. But sometimes we need to take a pause and understand that the populations of countries like Brazil in the US have more in common than what we have with some European countries, perhaps. So we have commitment to democratic freedoms. We have a racial situation which is complex, but requires social justice. And we need to find a more effective way to mobilize those links and discussions among the populations. Now, the issue of Venezuela, to make it direct, I think that the climax of the sanctions used by Trump, those were in September 2020, and then our effort to implement more sanctions and the ability of the regime to find a way to accommodate was a situation where under any objective measure, had a failed strategy. Any study would tell you that sanctions as a way or as a strategy is not successful. So we are trying to find another way. We see that the US cannot be a political actor, but one that we need to have to support dialogue, and we need to consider taking concrete steps. And this is not something that is easy or simple or direct. Times take long, it's discoordinated, but we need to have, I would say, a mid to long-term view to find other alternatives other than getting hold of that as something that will never occur. You talked about not putting the pressure on citizens, but putting the pressure on governments. Are there any signs to be optimistic in the Venezuelan electoral scenario? The strategy that you're applying, do you think is that working? Well, the motivation rather than a maximum pressure strategy, that doesn't work. So we need to explore other alternatives. We have internationalized the issue of Venezuela to try to expand the consensus in favor of democracy based on humanitarian issues. So we are going to alleviate sanctions, and the other point is try to look for a direct influence, but also trying to support initiatives like in Colombia to facilitate the regional aspects so that the two parties start negotiating. But the Department of Justice is also doing its part, trying to look for assets that were stolen from Venezuela or the plane to Argentina, for instance. That could be one way to go, and at the same time, it is our responsibility in the legal and judicial sphere. So everything we do is based on a two-party legislation. So it is largely the guide that we have followed in implementing sanctions based on trying to keep a minimum two-party consensus. If we talk about where do you draw a line in your discourse, and again, human rights, free elections, transparent elections, what happens with democratic conditions? And I think about Mexico. Many people say, how is it possible that you have not pronounced when talking about militarization of public safety, when we talk about the Supreme Court in Mexico, people that come out with a terrible situation, the president of the court, and the efforts to weaken. What comes to your mind? Can you say, I'm going to draw a line here because we need to pronounce ourselves because the civil society is affected and the impact is also against you? So this is also a matter of national security. Well, it is not a black or white issue. We need to find the opportunities for ourselves. We need to say something public based on principles, and Mexico is a special case. Being neighbors and considering the stories we have and the history we have, something that we say in public may lead to the opposite result, and sometimes also puts the nationalistic position against the US. I believe that this should be a debate in Mexico Now, how can we use the tools we have? For instance, the presidential profile and other leaders to protect the civil society, to protect reporters and journalists, becoming a national player in debates that must be taken in countries. And I must be careful here. There are some things to consider. When Mexico starts the election, the discussion about the IEN. So if we talk about that topic in particular and we define a position of ourselves, the result could be wrong, and the polls, the surveys, this is the voice of Mexicans. So there are different points of view how elections in the country must be conducted. Mexicans don't know who their representatives are, and all have a commitment to their institutions. And this is something that we need to take a step behind.
Nuestros colegas en la sociedad civil debatimos cómo podemos.
So we discuss how can we evaluate and discuss how can we do it in a constructive manner, recognizing that we are not going to solve these debates from the US, but having a fundamental national interest in economic stability, because there is a direct implication. Fentanyl, 2 years in a row in the US, affecting thousands of people. And the president in Mexico said Mexico does not produce fentanyl. Are you concerned in terms of national security, the fact that the military is controlling the ports and this greater footprint of the military in each and every activity, but on this aspect in particular, fentanyl, drug dealing, narco trafficking, organized crime? The truth is that in this aspect, the role of CEMAR at the ports has led to more transparency. They were the Homeland Security and the Department of State have been mechanisms, more effective mechanisms. Maybe in terms of the fentanyl, what worries me, not so much Mexico, but with the fentanyl, we have the problem that we have seen cocaine that was grown in large areas, and cocaine was trafficked in tons. And that same strategy will have an impact now on a drug where private sectors import chemicals, large chemicals, but then manufactured in small areas and now trafficked in small envelopes. So this is not just a matter of attacking the challenge where trafficking comes from, but also working in the US to reduce demand, to reduce trafficking of weapons. We are doing it, but it takes time to be effective. This administration has invested $5.5 billion to reduce demand. That's a lot, but it's a very complicated challenge. And allow me to, one of the questions made early, the active electoral cycle that comes now. What about Guatemala, when the anti-corruption prosecutor talked about the fact that the conditions do not exist for the upcoming elections? What are you going to do? How are you going to approach this? And there was a call with the president not long ago. Well, maybe this is not the best answer. I need to emphasize the role of the OAS in this point. They have a great electoral role. So there may be alarming characteristics in certain countries, but that should be a point for us to have a conversation about the viability of elections in Guatemala or anywhere. Now, the issue of corruption is complicated. We can punish everybody, Guatemala, Honduras, wherever, but that is not what is going to change the things, because it's a structural challenge. And after the Cold War, we thought markets will solve everything, but we didn't realize that there was not an institutional basis of the countries. So we may win or lose, but our effort working with health organizations, for instance, is key.
So, in terms of what you're discussing with this new consensus, Jake Sullivan said this time demands us to develop a new consensus. So let me ask you, isn't it a bit too late within the Biden administration? We're already talking about elections pretty soon, and Republican candidates will start taking the narratives of pending issues between the US and Latin America in order to attack Latin America. So aren't we a little bit late to present a new consensus, maybe suggesting that trade agreements or free trade agreements are no longer such good tools, and now we should focus on small and micro agreements? Let me say that we have 5 years and a half to have the agenda, to cover the agenda, so we still have time. But I promise you that I won't make a status point. So the first year of the Biden administration, the focus was on strengthening the domestic, the tools that we have in power, and the president has passed historical investment measures in the Inflation Reduction Act and many other things, all of that to position the US for competition. That has been priority one. And also do this in such a way that we are also attacking many of the injustices existing also in Latin America. So this is something that has also led us to try to forge and prioritize those links and commercial relations with Latin America. But the truth is that if we're going to compete with China, for instance, in Latin America, and we want to have an economic policy that builds upon free trade agreements, right now we are trying to compete with tools from the past in a field where China and other countries are using tools of the future. So the second part has been that many of the reforms that we try to conduct, anti-FTA reforms, in order to have the tools. I mean, many people here is familiar with China Aid Data project, where they have measured all the contracts that China has worldwide, but also in Latin America. And the conclusion they make is that there's no faster, more efficient country that has the greatest impact in moving infrastructure projects than China. And either we don't compete in that space, or we need to develop our tools in order to compete in that space. Right now, the tools that we have are not enough. I only have 5 minutes left, and just like in TV, I will have to go faster with some questions and some answers. Let me include also Haiti. Very few people want to talk about Haiti. President Luis Abinader has said, we have a problem. Has it failed? I mean, has the politics failed? Well, we talk a lot about Haiti, and President thinks a lot about Haiti. The question is, you see Haiti and you say, okay, an international power needs to improve the situation, but also you understand that in the past, it has never improved the situation. So what we've done is to try to learn more from our own history and acknowledge that law enforcement presence is necessary, but we also need to emphasize political dialogue between elites that many times the country suffers due to a lack of coherence between those groups. And this is something that I think that the mistake we've made is that great part of the work done in Haiti has been in the backstage, working with Canada and some other countries. But this is something that we are already trying to improve. We are trying to raise that debate. The single challenge in terms of the next few steps in Haiti is that the Security Council, if they don't want the authorization of Chapter 7, countries such as China are going to block that. So how should we discuss that within a context where the option of unilateral intervention is not the one that we are going to go for? The multilateral system needs to see this as a priority. So this is difficult given the history. It's no easy answer to that. Okay, multilateral. Since we're talking about elections, I forgot about how Argentina and about the delicate situation they're undergoing in this negotiation with the International Monetary Fund, a country with an inflation of over 109%. Data from May are terrible. How are you bolstering or working with them so as to have good solution with that negotiation? This is very difficult for Argentina. This is an electoral year. We are doing the same thing that we did when they restructured the agreement, which is to have a close look of the IMF staff work. And when they reach an agreement, we, together with the board, with Argentina and some other countries, we're going to try to understand that the context that we have is unique and that we need mainly and mostly, despite the fact that Argentina may not be the best example, I think that the fund needs to prove that we can answer to this type of challenges in this type of contexts. And I believe that their behavior in terms of Argentina will give a signal to Argentina. I don't want to leave aside other countries such as Ecuador that have done all things right in the end. And we don't want those countries that are doing things right be forgotten by the bank because the loan is not as big. So we need to find a way to do that. So in terms of the debts of many Latin American countries and Caribbean countries, how do we solve this role of China as one of the countries that grants more loans? Well, we have to see that. So we need to see this in Argentina and other countries before the election. Do you see some results? You need to have disbursements. This is a critical level of reserves. Well, that will be in line with the IMF stuff, but we've told to Argentina and to the board that here from the White House, we're following you closely and we'll do all we can within the context of the fund. I only have 1 minute left. So what makes you think that if we get a new administration, that will be removed by them? We saw that with Trump and the case of Mexico. But the rest of the strategy and policies with the rest of the countries, is that at stake? Well, I think that we're not only having the tools of the past in order to compete with this context, but I also believe some of the ideologies of the past. I think that we need to recognize that, for instance, President Petro, President Lula, and some others will say things that we don't like. Sometimes we don't agree with them. What we need to find a way to forge a common cause with all elected leaders, regardless of their ideology. And this is something that is hard for us because what we try to do is to sometimes impose a policy or thinking that there are easy solutions to those matters or thinking that maybe the U.S. will be protected from global disruption that we've never seen in 30, 40 years. But there are policies that may not work. So to conclude, what do you think about the idea of not giving more power exploration contracts in Colombia, for instance? That could represent more poverty and more migratory pressure. So how do you approach those realities? We might make an analysis, but being a Colombian American, I know that Colombia has very strong institutions, sound institutions, where those debates will be held by Colombian people, and we might share our points of view directly. We won't make them public with them. For instance, the anti-drug policy of President Petro, sometimes part of the policy is still being developed, and we don't really agree with that plan. But we've been able to have conversations with mutual respect in such a way that we've been able to collaborate. And let me highlight also that cooperation with Colombia under Petro's administration has been sustained. Of course, we disagree on some points, but some political aspects in Colombia are not our own struggles, though, even though as a Colombian American having an opinion, I mean, the government of the US is not a political player within the Colombian government. Thank you very much for speaking with us. Thank you for this opportunity, Juan.
Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you, Juan. We are now at our last panel of the day. It will address perhaps the most existential topic, one that I know that many of us have been waiting to hear about, the ongoing global fight against climate change. So I invite you all to stay for this panel. Our expert panelists are not here to talk about the devastating impact of climate change as well as in Latin America and all of our region. This session is going to be moderated by Alicia Montalvo, Manager of Climate Action and Positive Biodiversity at CAF Development Bank of Latin America. I want to invite Alicia Montalvo then, and she's going to introduce the rest of the panelists. Her professional career has focused on the field of international, thank you, thanks for that, financial cooperation and environmental economics, always in public institutions. So I wanted to know if she's already ready to come and join in welcoming Alicia Montalvo and panelists to the stage for this session. Welcome all.
Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for attending this session that covers one of the topics that is very important and quite comprehensive during the conference. We're talking about gender, migration, we're talking about health, security, and all of that is very much related to the problems derived from climate change. This session that is represented mostly by women, so this gives us a lot of satisfaction, will be mainly focused on how we need to address the funding for the green transition in Latin America. And the goal is to understand whether the fundamental issues are being addressed in order to facilitate this transition, considering the specificities of the region. So from CAF, we are working so that 40% of our funding is devoted to green operations, both climate change and biodiversity. And one of the aspects that we're mostly concerned about is how to work so as to consider investment in climate aspects and biodiversity aspects as something that generates profitability. We're not talking about expenses, we're talking about profitability from the environmental point of view, of course, but also social and economic points of view. So that's why I'm glad to share this panel with three people that really know a lot about the challenges derived from climate change. First of all, Daniela Stevens. She is Director of the Energy Transition and Climate Program at the Inter-American Dialogue. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. We also have Genevieve Connors. She is manager for environment, natural resources, and blue economy in the World Bank, and she's been working for a long time also on climate change global group from the World Bank. And Helen Merovic, she is in IDB Invest, the private sector of the IDB, and she's responsible for climate change. So first of all, I would like to start the session with a question, mostly general question, but at the same time, it allowed us to know a bit better about how your organizations address green transition. We're talking about moving forward towards cleaner economies. We're talking a lot about energy transition, but we would need to expand a little bit on that. How to speak about green energy or a green transition. How do you work in the different organizations? Daniela, thank you very much. Alicia, thank you. CAF, Inter-American Dialogue, and OAS to invite me to participate here. So before I begin addressing all of this, I would like to set the stage.
To remind us why having this conversation is important, is more urgent than ever right now. The COVID-19 pandemic upended the region's fiscal position in 2020, with potentially long-lasting consequences that we still don't see to this day. So despite limited fiscal space, countries adopted unprecedented large-scale support packages, averaging 4.6% of GDP in Latin America alone. This sharp rise in expenditure combined with falling tax revenue led to the creation of large deficits. The average balance for Latin America and the Caribbean in 2020 reached between 6 and 7% of its GDP. To put it in context and in perspective, the deficit in Latin America was larger than that during the 1980s debt crisis. So these dynamics led to a sharp increase in public debt levels in both subregions, Latin America, the Caribbean. Public debt reached an average of 89% in the Caribbean. Barbados and Suriname were particularly exposed, with a debt of around 30% of their GDP. So we must consider this dire baseline scenario when we think about climate change, when institutions like the Inter-American Dialogue, who do the convening, who do the bringing together of stakeholders, think about climate change, which could cost Latin America between 1 and 5% of its GDP each year. Already, extreme weather events are causing power outages, causing transportation disruptions. And in Central America, it's costing 2% of the annual GDP. So the need for scaling climate investments is substantial, and it cannot be achieved by the private sector or the public sector alone. And I think that's one of the main roles of the Inter-American Dialogue, is to bring together these different stakeholders, including academia, including civil society as well, to create an agenda of comprehensive reforms, one that is that aligns domestic policy with international climate fluxes to finally address the crisis. Broadly speaking, we can distinguish between two types of financial flows. The first is equity investment, which seek to generate financial returns or loans that must be repaid. And the other is climate aid, which is given as a grant with no expectation of return. In this context of polycrisis, equity investment or loans cannot be the only mechanism used. Latin America and the Caribbean receives less funding for climate assistance than Africa, than the Asia Pacific region, and of the financing they do receive, 60 to 70% is in the form of loans. In a region already facing widespread debt, adding to the debt burden presents challenges. And at the same time, access to loans is very centralized in the largest economies, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia. Of these investments, around 80% go to mitigation, not to adaptation, which receives only around 20%. So in our conversations with stakeholders, with experts at the dialogue, we have noticed more and more that the quality of what is invested is as important as the quantity that is invested. A large share is spent on areas where needs are not clearly defined because there is a lack of capacity in expressing those needs. So there is an urgency to assess whether the extent of support that is being given corresponds to the needs on the ground. And also a need to recognize that this support cannot be driven by profit alone. And there is also a need for consistency in financial flows with the vision of equity. And these two concepts, consistency and equity, should be present now more than ever in our conversations with stakeholders, including international financial institutions. So to sum up my first comment, I'm going to lay out very quickly a couple of ways in which I think MDB roles can play a key, MDB can play a key role in addressing the climate crisis. And I'm going to keep it very brief because I'm preaching to the choir. Can I?
Yes.
Thank you. So first, they can help attract private capital by providing technical assistance, improving government's institutional capacity, helping in the creation and harmonization of green taxonomies across the region, and building the local currency bond market to broaden the set of domestic investors. Technical assistance can also be provided to the private sector in the developing world to prepare projects that are of interest for foreign investors. They can help national governments develop and establish a credible climate and investment legal framework to substantially reduce risk, political risk, sovereign risk. Second, they can, and I know you've heard this word probably today 1,000 times, the risk. They can help the risk capital investments, or rather implement risk sharing mechanisms to reduce the cost of capital for projects through blended finance. In the current context, there is very little private money flowing to the region. So MDBs can increase these flows by partnering and reducing political risks using guarantees and insurance products. And finally, they can form coalitions with the private and the public sectors, not only in public-private partnerships, but to trigger systemic change. For example, in regulations, in pushing for transparency, for mandatory disclosure requirements, and overall lowering the systemic risk. But finally, I think it's very important that they institutionalize coordinated responses to take advantage of the momentum built around all these calls for reform, and create, say, annual meetings where the only topic that they address is climate change. I look forward to hearing from my peers how they're already integrating these tools into their projects.
Thank you very much. Very long list of recommendations, very useful. So it was very, very relevant what you said, that there's money for mitigation, but not so much for adaptation or even for biodiversity. So I would like to go deeper into this question with Jen, from your experience first in climate change and now in biodiversity and natural resources. What do you think that the World Bank is doing to really work on the green transition that takes into consideration not only CO2 emissions, but other elements related to biodiversity and ecosystems? Thank you, Jen.
I have to use this? Yeah? Okay. Thank you very much. So interesting that you're asking me about adaptation and biodiversity, and I did want to start by saying that 2 years ago, the World Bank Group issued its new climate change action plan for the years 21 to 25. And in the Latin America, Caribbean region, we also did a drill down version of that for the specific region, which I'd be happy to share afterwards, our roadmap for climate action. And it focused on a few things. And one of the things was targeting the large, high-emitting sectors where most of the carbon emissions come from, energy, transport, agriculture, cities, manufacturing, and so on. But what's interesting about Latin America and the Caribbean as a region, so what makes it different from the rest of the world? How would a climate change action plan change when looking at this specific region? So just a few things to remember. The region together constitutes only about 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not a large contributor right now. The question, of course, is as we go in pathways towards 2030, towards 2050, as other regions in the world decarbonize, if business as usual continues in Latin America and the Caribbean, that share, of course, will go very far, much higher. The other thing that's interesting for Latin America and the Caribbean as a region is that about half of those emissions come from agriculture, forestry, and land use change. And that's completely, so almost 50% of Latin America and the Caribbean's emissions. And that's completely different from the global average, which is about 19 or 20%. LAC, as a region, also has the Caribbean, full of small island states, extremely vulnerable to the impacts of extreme weather, of climate change, worsening over time. And of course, it is a region rich in natural capital and biodiversity. It's home to the Amazon, which not only houses as carbon about 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions annually, but also is currently facing a potential threat of a massive tipping point. About 18% of the forest has been deforested relative to when records were kept. If we hit that 20-25%, scientists predict there will be a massive tipping point in the Amazon, which will cause hydrological shock, meteorological shock waves throughout the world and release massive amounts of carbon. So Latin America is incredibly different, as every region is, but this is what makes it different when we as a World Bank group think about what we do in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's different than what we think about from the rest of the world. We think about how can we work in the agriculture sector? How can we work in the forestry sector to reduce those emissions, to prevent the depletion of carbon, but also, as you said, to support ensuring the retention of biodiversity, ecosystem services, because the two, nature and climate, are so deeply intertwined across the world, but certainly in Latin America and the Caribbean. We've committed as a World Bank group to aligning all our finance with the goals of the Paris Agreement, something we've worked very closely with the IDB on and other MDBs over the years, and that comes into effect in July. But we've also committed that on average 35% of our finance would be for climate action. And about half of that globally is in fact for adaptation. So we've really tried to focus as much on adaptation as we do on mitigation, and that holds for our financing in Latin America and the Caribbean as well.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting to see the approach that World Bank has. Let's go now to Multilateral Development Bank, smaller as the IDB, smaller but big at the same time. Helen, me ha parecido muy interesante la reflexión sobre la necesidad de avanzar en...
Helen, and I thought it was very interesting to move towards adaptation. You are part of IDB Invest, which is a private arm. So how do you approach the financing aspect from the private sector? And anything that you want to explore in that regard? Thank you, Alicia. Thank you for the invitation and for having IDB Invest in this panel. As Alicia said, we are a relatively new agency. We have grown a lot and we hope to keep on growing. When we started in 2016 as a big group, we had the goal of reaching 30%. And in 2019, we changed our goal to have a floor of 30% of our funding towards climate investments. So this was related to our purpose of raising awareness towards green assets, climate assets. In 2022, we approved a new methodology to do what you just mentioned, combining biodiversity and climate. Those two agendas are very important framework agreements, framework conventions that appear to be separate, but now are very much close. And that is why that meant that climate finance only as a measure could be de-incentivizing what we call nature-positive investments. That is why we shifted towards green finance, expanding the definition so that we could incentivize investment officials. So this is just to set the context of our goal ever since 2019, this minimum 30% goal in climate finance. And now we are working on our new strategy. The strategy is expected to be approved in 2023 and to last until 2030. So This will mean that we are working, at least in the private sector, in two ways. On the one hand, the financial sector of the region in a very powerful action, trying to look for assets in the region, working with banks and capital markets in order to protect taxonomies, creating the theme bonds, showing that that could be an interesting green asset, and the market begins to understand how it works, what it needs. An SBO, the type of assets that are behind the green bond and the blue bonds. We also have a blue bond in Ecuador, and as part of those, we combine with technical assistance to adopt new frameworks like the TNSD or TFDs. In addition to the financial sector, we supplement that part with the real economy, attacking those sectors that are high maintenance, that is to say, manufacturing sector, but agribusiness and the like. And one of the pillars, the third pillar, is adaptation. And when we think about adaptation, first, we know we need to clearly understand what adaptation means. So, even though capital markets know clearly that 1 ton of CO2 that is avoided in China or in Brazil or here in Washington, D.C. is the same thing. And it's important in that way to compare and to decide whether they want to put the money in China, in Brazil, in Argentina, or wherever. So the market efficiency works very well. So it's an adaptation that is localized. If we are talking about water, droughts, or a hurricane, those are differentiated impacts. So if we are able to have that, let's say, variety of activities that could be classified as adaptation, the markets don't get it so easily. Markets and investment officials. So we need to make a good training, a good education. So once we can understand resilience, taxonomies, adaptation, we are closer to attracting more financing. And I will make a pause now. Thank you. So at the COP meeting, there was a group created that was called Adaptation Partnership. And as responsible for climate change matters in my country, Spain, I got involved. And I remember they sent emails and they ended up saying patience, be patient. So the last word was patience. And I said, this is really complex, until I learned that the person who led the matter was called patience. And I couldn't dissociate adaptation from patience. So I'm not sure if Mrs. Patience is hearing me, is listening to me now, but
evolution. I would like to know how did you foresee the role of the World Bank now in the architecture for climate change and biodiversity? Do you foresee changes, if you can say that?
Thank you very much. Well, tomorrow we have a new president who starts tomorrow morning, and not that the entire mandate of the World Bank Group is a function of one person, and we have, of course, a very active board. But I do foresee changes for many reasons. I think under the new leadership of the World Bank Group, we will be more focused on climate, but not only climate. I mean, there is no question of the World Bank Group becoming a so-called climate bank. We remain a bank focused on development and poverty alleviation, reduction of inequality. But I think that it's impossible to go back on the idea that climate and development are intertwined. I mean, they're deeply intertwined. And anyone who says that, we shouldn't focus on climate, we should only focus on development, is really out to lunch. I think the World Bank will absolutely continue to focus on climate in the ways that we've already set forth. But what I'm hoping will change is a greater focus on working more closely with our sisters and brothers in multilateral development institutions, including IDB and CAF, and with the private sector. And I think the new president brings very much that mission and that mandate, and that is part of the so-called evolution roadmap that the World Bank Group is drafting and has promised to the world at the annual meetings in Marrakesh this year, the joint annual meetings with the IMF, to think more strategically about how we can mobilize more resources collectively for the needs of the world. Climate action, climate finance needs are estimated in the range of $6 trillion per year, and we are nowhere near there, even on mitigation, which is ostensibly easier to fund in some sectors because of the revenue streams. For example, renewable energies becoming more and more competitive in the markets with traditional fossil fuel sources. Working in adaptation, we were just talking about marine protected areas, for example. These are areas where it is harder to invest, but it is possible to work more closely with foundations, with concessional money, with the private sector, with institutional investors, to de-risk capital, as Daniela was saying, and I think that will be a huge focus of the World Bank going forward. I also think there will be a greater focus on global public goods, one of which is, of course, around climate action, climate change, not the only one. We're also interested in pandemics. We're also interested in other aspects of global public goods. I personally hope, and we've been championing for a big push on forests, a big push on tropical forests, including, but not only the Amazon, as an area that the World Bank can step up its involvement in. But let's see, the new change starts tomorrow. So thank you.
We will be looking at the news, yes. Daniela, desde el diálogo
Daniela, from the Inter-American Dialogue, the work that you do of creating these spaces of encounter and meeting is great in order to move towards these topics, right? And also the link to migration, security, so on and so forth. So is there a change in the way that you raise the dialogue? The fact that now we are talking about all these sectors, climate change, loss of biodiversity, does it limit your work in one way? And how do you see the need that there are multidisciplinary teams when it comes to raising dialogues? Excellent question. Do you have a microphone? I think you can hear me with this lapel mic. I think the question is excellent. In the dialogue, we have 5 programs, and with each program, we can think of an area where we have some overlap in migration and development. For instance, we can think about climate migration, climate change. With the area of Asia and Latin America, we think about the important role of China as the main global emission and the lack of diplomacy in China and the US. This can promote the agenda, diplomatic agenda. So in the rule of law program, we can think about the human rights of all people who are defending these rights in the region. So we have this multidisciplinary group of experts. We can no longer be isolated. And every year, there is one more statistic, and this forces us to have these conversations. And I see the role of the Inter-American Dialogue, for example, as a platform where we need to promote the South-South cooperation, but also the North-South relationship, promote the trust in multilateral entities. And I invite to the table all stakeholders, civil society, the academia, not just to talk about this matter, but also to be accountable and have a track in time. For instance, saying last year we promised this, On the next CAF conference, our role will be to ask what the advances were. And statistics are really important to follow, and that is our role. Very interesting indeed. And also make that follow-up, right? Sometimes there are many calls related to climate and biodiversities, and we cannot measure the progress. You talked about the mistrust in multilateral agencies. In your experience, do you perceive that there is distrust? Is there a new moment now starting? Because I guess that the topic is increasingly part of the agendas. Is there any change? Well, from what we see when we work with clients from the private sector in Latin America and the Caribbean, these clients look for the seal of approval that we have. They know that we do things with high standards. They know that we are taking care of the social and environmental safeguards, and that means that we will be able to negotiate a bigger package if we bring private actors into the table. So this is not a mistrust that I see. Quite the contrary, there is a role among multilateral entities when we work in the region that know that this is not a greenwashing. When we say that there is a green asset, it is a green asset because there is a technical knowledge behind, a technical team behind that is assessing the transactions to know that we are working with the highest standards. So I see increased appetite, let's say, for multilaterals to come onto the table and bring with them institutional and non-institutional investors and also domestic capital. So in that context, IDB Invest in March, when the governors approved the possibility of working in the increasing capital, we are thinking that this new business model that IDB Invest will have is based on the fact that we will be a platform of attraction of private capital to combine with many instruments. We don't want to have one instrument only in dollars, for instance, but rather we want to work in local currencies. In the Caribbean, we need to work in the private sector with local currency, for instance. Local currencies plus equities. We need to have the capacity of providing equity and also advisory. A problem we have sometimes is not the lack of appetite of private capital to invest in green assets, but the problem is to create good green assets in the region. So we need to work with the public sector to create the assets, to make an upstream, as we say, to create projects that have technical assistance, advisory, donation funds, for instance, that can come from different countries to create a quality project. So initially, maybe as IDB Invest, but then funded by the private sector.
It's very interesting. In CAF, we have the same challenge. In fact, right now we're moving technical assistance funds for specific projects that are linked not only to climate change, but also biodiversity, where we believe is much more complicated to decide a good project with good indicators that could take private investment or investment from other players. I think that one of our mandates is to cooperate as institutions in all G20, G7, and COPs. There's always a mandate that multilateral institutions should cooperate and also international organizations in general should cooperate. What are we doing wrong that we are always asked to cooperate? What is it that we were unable to give that step as much as we had? And we have that perception that each has its own strategy and there's an inefficient use of resources. And maybe you would like to be the first to answer?
I think that's a fantastic question. The dialogue aside, and just from the perspective of the finance institutions, CAF, IDB, IDB Invest, World Bank, IFC MIGA, we're all working in the same regions. And it's a very good question. Are we collaborating sufficiently? Are we efficient as a collective of global capital coming to the region? And I mean, I think the answer is, well, there's a lot more we could do. As banks, as institutions, we provide essentially knowledge and finance. That finance is our own account finance, or that's finance that's mobilized. You mentioned going to get additional technical assistance resources to prepare projects. We work with other sources of pure concessional finance, for example, the Global Environment Facility. We'll work with the private sector. Helen just gave some good examples where we de-risk capital or we work to bring in additional sources of financing, but ultimately we provide a financing package. Otherwise, we provide a knowledge package that might be technical assistance from our own staff, from firms that we hire, or our own analytics and our own research. And I think there's huge room for us to collaborate in those 4 areas of analytics, technical support, own account finance, and leveraged finance. We have to remember that our clients, Latin America and the Caribbean, particularly some countries in Latin America and a few in the Caribbean, are middle-income countries or high-income countries, quite sophisticated, very innovative. Some of the most innovative financial mechanisms like sovereign sustainability-linked bonds have been launched first in the world in Chile and Uruguay. We have countries like Barbados who are at the forefront of the fight for climate justice and loss and damage in terms of financial flows for climate. But these countries, for the most part, have not graduated. They're still recipient countries. There's still very uneven capacity. And I think we have a duty of care to our clients to not come crashing down in all different directions, competing or fighting over each other. So I do think if we could, in the coming years, as we go COP by COP, pick a few areas where we really want to collaborate. And I think a perfect first mover would be in the area of climate finance.
Yes, no, I think it's important that we reflect again on how to collaborate. And now we have new teams in the IDB and World Bank also. Well, it has been 1.5 years ago in CAF, but I think it's an opportunity to really reflect on that. Helen, ¿cómo ves tú?
Helen, how do you see institutional collaboration also from the perspective of a private sector? I believe that, adding to what Jan was saying, we've been working and we do have experience in definitions, taxonomy, climate finance, and not only the definition in IDB, but others where CAF is also a member. We compare notes, we have lessons learned about what is being told and what is being said. I think that all of that is quite clear, but the problem is when we get to the countries. And so there, we need to see how to create working platforms in countries. Part of the discussion in the new mindset of NDB groups is to do country platforms where we can have everyone. Everyone can say what we have. Some people might have more analytics, more knowledge, as the papers that are prepared by the World Bank, but based on the analysis done by the World Bank, we could choose the type of interventions we could have and where we have the competitive advantage. Why duplicating actions if the best thing, and maybe we could add the different parts and have greater synergy, because the truth is that each of our institutions has different capacities, different internal capabilities. My group, IDB Invest, it's 10 of us working on climate change for all transactions that we are doing. The World Bank has a lot more capacity. And having the recognition that capacities can be different, but that if we add them up, we can get more things. This is a very important first step that we need to make, and we are working towards that. So let's move forward. Daniela, there is something that we've been working on a lot in institutions. This is the impact in climate change and all communities and all indigenous communities. I'd like to know whether in dialogue you've prioritize all of these, and how can we move forward to generate spaces where we could have the participation of these communities that sometimes find it harder to be involved in international negotiations? Of course it is.
The former director of the energy program of the dialogue, and she spearheaded an initiative in Central America so that vulnerable, not only indigenous communities, but all other vulnerable and excluded and sub-represented groups such as women were part of the climate adaptation conversations with President Biden in the context of the root causes strategy. And now, based on that initiative, we are spearheading another initiative in the Caribbean this time, whereby we want to bring civil society representatives from indigenous groups, from all the traditionally sub-represented, the youth that has an important leadership role in the fight against climate change. We want to bring them to the table with the Biden-Harris administration to advise on how to better implement PAC 2030, the Partnership for Addressing Climate Change. So at the dialogue, we have this vocation for bringing civil society into the conversations where their voice is most needed. One of them is climate change, of course, and not only in our program, also in the migration and remittances program that also address the development needs of the most vulnerable, and how to leverage our voice, our platform, the media as well, to create these kind of conversations and create representation where 10 years ago there was none. And it's usually the private sector who has the closest access to policymakers. And at the dialogue, we want to change that. To add, because the private sector is crucial and will continue to play a crucial role. But civil society as well, as I was mentioning, the traditionally excluded populations in the most vulnerable regions of our sub-regions.
Muchas gracias. Yo creo que has
Thank
puesto.
you very much. I think that you've set on the table a topic that is very important, that has to do with equality. Ultimately, equality is a big problem in the region, and the impact of climate change are unequal because it affects the most vulnerable communities. Maybe to go back to transition, and maybe I'd like to start with Jen. How can we work on a green transition that at the same time does not really affect the poorest and most vulnerable collectives? How can we conciliate this transition towards moving to improve equality indicators? Because sometimes we talk about energy transition or green energy. Kiro?
Sorry.
How can we think of a green transition? Susie?
How could we work in the green transition, not only in energy, but especially on energy, and at the same time, not to make that the impacts of this transition most vulnerable people of this,
which are more coal intensive. So, for example, in South Africa, or in Asia, or in India, where you have countries who are largely dependent on coal, and this idea of a just transition, a just energy transition, needs to take into consideration, for example, reskilling entire populations that are currently dependent on an industry that is expected to sunset, sometimes very rapidly. So job skilling programs, but because coal is not a big problem in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's already a region that is highly dependent on renewable energy, and because it's not such a large source of emissions for the world has not paid attention to this story as much. So I think it's an excellent question, because now what's emerging, and this is one of the reasons I stress this importance of focusing globally on forests, is what can we do to support the protection of forests in a way that allows jobs and access to high-value markets for areas and communities that will no longer be allowed, essentially, to deforest and to keep expanding the agricultural frontier. And so there's this question of justice and supporting not just the poorest, but also those spatially located in areas which are now being called to be protected. This was something that was discussed at some length during the spring meetings recently. And I have to say, I don't know that we have a very good answer. Obviously, adaptation is key because we know that the impacts of climate change, whether they're disasters or slow onset disasters like drought, you mentioned the drought in Spain, these affect the poorest the most. So we know that investments in adaptation are key to mitigating the impacts on the poorest and the most vulnerable. But we also want to ensure that the indigenous people, for example, poor communities living at the margins of the forestry, dependent on agroforestry, have a way to make a living from, for example, the bioeconomy that is real, that is really centered on true revenue, true jobs, true high quality of life and living standards and services, and not sort of a fantasy of a small, community making money out of small, non-timber forest products. And I think that's something that we really need to think about.
Can I complement? Yo creo que también estamos al frente de una oportunidad.
I think you're also facing an opportunity in order to reduce inequalities. The new economy and trying to new ways to generate energy with solar panels, for instance, also gives us an opportunity to include women in the construction process or the panel installment process. What we've seen is that by using, for instance, performance-based incentives, and a company that's trying to have a solar park, we give it a financial incentive to hire women or women engineers in solar panel installation. So there's no bias in this economy. So we can find an opportunity there if we do use the incentives in order to reduce inequality.
These training programs or these incentives with SDG goals. So how to link the green transition goals with the broader sustainable development goal of including women or of reducing income inequality, not only in labor, but also in the area of agriculture that you mentioned before. So the transition brings challenges, but also incredible opportunities.
Muchas gracias. Veo que coincidís que la transición.
Thank you very much. Do you agree that transition is a space for opportunity? And in fact, we are also speaking about reskilling programs and thinking about the future. We're thinking about niches of employment in Latin America. And I also believe that this is a message that is quite positive. So we're running out of time. So I am told that maybe we can open it up for a Q&A session now. Thank you for the opportunity of having this event, which is so important, in this all-female panel, which is so powerful, women that are working also in very important roles. My name is Soledad Garcia Muñoz. I'm the Special Rapporteur on Economic, Social, Cultural, and Environmental Rights of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And I wanted to talk about this. I wanted to bring human rights to your panel to see what are the initiatives that you're carrying forward so that the gender and transversality and human rights are also part of the actions that you are putting forward. In our region, we have very new and important developments as the Resolution 3/321 that was approved by the Commission. We have here the former president of that Commission, Antonio Orejola, and also damages and losses that at the COP, we had a good result of generating a fund, and I believe that your institutions will also have a very important role for that fund to be completed. Thank you very much. Thank you. Who would like to answer to that? I absolutely agree. I think that not seeing just environmental aspect or social aspect is also very important. And the way we're working with customers on that is joining both agendas. We cannot only work in the green aspect if after that project we don't really pay attention to the communities that we're working on. We cannot work on a port and think that we need a solution or a solution mechanism that is kilometers away from the port. Community needs to be part of the solution. Part of the investigation of the IDB in infrastructure projects is that when the community, the social community, or the social sector is not included in the analysis and the design of infrastructure, that infrastructure won't have the same value. The value needs to be a shared value for the whole community. And that vision is the one that we want to bolster, of course, with the performance standards and the sustainability policy that we have, both in the IDB Invest as well as the social and environmental policy at the IDB.
In the World Bank, I represent the environment sector, but we are 5 managers from the sustainable development sector, including social development and inclusion, urban infrastructure and disaster risk management, water resources management, and so on and so forth. I won't list them all, but the point is that the intersectionality, as you mentioned, is very much true. If 80% of climate disasters, climate losses in LAC are in cities, is that a city agenda or is that a climate agenda? You mentioned Escazú. You know, is that a forestry agenda or is that a access to information agenda? We think about migration in the region. I mean, a lot of migration, especially internal migration, is caused because of climate change, because of impacts to water supply or otherwise. To livelihood. So absolutely what you said is correct. It is hard to do well. It is very hard to do well, but I couldn't agree more with what you said.
Uno de los ejes rectores en nuestro programa de transición energética en el diálogo ha sido justicia climática.
Justice, climate justice, energy justice, and equity were the backbone in our strategy. And as we said, we are trying to include it in all of our research projects. Next week, we are going to have an event on inclusive climate change where we are going to bring the civil society for having a discussion to keep governments on track, what happened with the Escazú agreement, so on and so forth. In our Caribbean initiative, we also have this guiding point on justice so that we can include other problems, for instance, color problems, racism, gender exclusion, but thank you for your comment. I believe that the negotiations and conversations on climate change have fragmented successively from the moment that climate change split from biodiversity, air quality, and other aspects. We lose sight of the fact that everything affects people's quality of life. So it's a problem that causes poverty. So one thing comes from the other. From institutions, we are all trying to work so that the focus is placed on where it should be. Otherwise, there comes a moment when we forget what the purpose is. Hello, I am Camila. I work for an organization that is responsible for addressing conflicts in various regions. And my question is related to the previous question. How from your organizations you take into account regional conflicts or civil conflicts, for instance, in Chile with the Mapuches or in Colombia? How do you deal with this type of problematics in your organizations, considering the climate change goals, of course?
Excellent question, and the person on my colleague who's an expert on this would give you the perfect answer. It's obviously incredibly complicated for so many reasons. In Colombia, you mentioned, the peace process is inextricably linked with deforestation. So when the government asks us to come and support them on a national halting deforestation or forest reforestation program, it means going into areas that either are or have been in conflict. It means working with indigenous groups that may or may not agree or be in conflict with each other. And one of the things we try, and you're actually asking an excellent question, because one of the tensions we have, for example, we're working in the Orinoquia region in Colombia, and when we work there, we're very careful to make sure, for example, in an emissions reductions program, that we build a benefit sharing program so that local communities benefit from whatever payments are being made for carbon credits, essentially. But who gets the money? And who decides? And who represents who? And so this is usually as a result of extensive engagement. We have these safeguards policies that also require us to do extensive consultation and stakeholder engagement. I'm sure we don't get it right all the time. It's an incredibly complex thing. It's the business of governing states that banks are trying to support governments in doing. But we do have systems in place to try to do the best we can to share benefits and to protect those whose rights may be contested.
Muy bien, tomamos más preguntas para que puedan hablar.
Good. Maybe we can open up to more questions. I am Cristina Burelli from Venezuela. We work in Venezuela with indigenous communities, and my experience after many years here in Washington, working in fundraising for countries like Venezuela, is that there is a disconnect between the policies of multilateral entities. So we say, okay, there are policies that want to empower indigenous communities, that want to take action. But then when those indigenous communities try to look for money, and organizations like mine, we don't have the mechanisms. It's like an ocean that there is between the policies and reaching out to the communities. So of course there are problems of diversity, so on and so forth, but I see a connection problem. Here at the top, US, IDB, so on and so forth, and the community. How can we bridge those two instances? I started saying that we are also working with training programs, right? Because many of the things that we also present must be landed on communities, not just indigenous communities, but others as well. But I agree with you that there is a disconnect that we need to work on. But well, maybe my panel experts have a better answer. The only thing that I would complement is that working with the private sector, we see that there are clients who are private actors. We don't work with communities. Maybe the IDB could have, but when you were asking the question, I was thinking about a startup that can go to Bid Lab, that will give the seed capital, and then we entered into a valley of death. That is to say, they reach an investment of, let's say, $5 million at Bid Lab, and we can only finance the last part in projects of 20 million and above. So what happens in the middle? Well, we are working on that as well. In the new business model, we are trying to invest more in equities because we want to make this bridge between the startup that is starting, that wants to pilot a model, to the biggest investment in a company. This doesn't necessarily respond to the issue of the indigenous communities, but I also see the disconnect. Maybe one thing is a multilateral bank that works with the private sector, and then there are foundations, perhaps. But it's important to do this training. Which door do we need to knock on? I agree with this gap that you see, but I don't think that there is an immediate answer, unfortunately, but part of the answer is a representation, an authentic representation. Maybe the benefit sharing is important, of course, into communities, but also making them feel that their voice is part of the solution. In the dialogue, we try not to distance from hard discussions. So how do we deal with distribution conflicts? This idea that this money is not going to a community, for instance. We need not to go away from these uncomfortable discussions, which are, of course. We have 1 minute left. One more question, perhaps. Hello, thank you for the panel. People talk about the fact that, in general, the carbon emissions in this hemisphere are lower, and those emissions come from the use of land. And the idea would be to create a carbon off market. So what have we learned from that? Amazon Fund, perhaps, or what were the efforts taken in that regard? And again, this is related to the use of the land, the respect for the land, of course, but how can we really communicate the message that we are not the cause for climate change, actually?
Carbon markets at all. We didn't talk about voluntary carbon markets or regulated carbon markets, but whether they're markets or justice mechanisms of funds transfer, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, which is essentially in order to play a global role to prevent something that wasn't caused by the region, what does the region need to get financially in order to sequester carbon, in soil and trees and natural resources, and who pays and how does that money flow? And we're talking at a scale of billions of dollars per year. And so these are the kinds of things that I know, our presidents and new governments in Colombia and Brazil are talking about. There are several summits coming up. There's the COP coming up. President Lula has already said in 2 years he would like to host the COP in Belém. And these are the kinds of conversations that they are trying to have so that there are systems in place to regulate the market. And apropos the previous comments that you made, I mean, one of the most moving conversations I had was in Bogota with an association of sort of para-association of indigenous groups, several indigenous groups, where several indigenous leaders said to us that they really felt the future for them was in carbon markets. And my jaw sort of dropped because I was not expecting that comment at all. But in a system of payments that is just, that is fair, that is regulated, that has standards, because otherwise you have the carbon cowboys out there buying land, buying carbon, paying whatever price, and then essentially squeezing out the deforestation to other areas. So I don't have the answer, but I can tell you that I don't think the climate finance architecture is ready to meet the scale of the problem. I don't think we have a source of finance large enough to do massive emissions reductions programs. But I know that this is, for example, what the Prime Minister of Barbados is raising in the Bridgetown Initiative. And I know that this is what the president of the IDB and the World Bank, who are traveling together in 2 weeks to Peru and to Jamaica, are exactly talking about. Not that we solve it, but it's absolutely the critical problem of the next 2 to 5 years till we get to 2030. And one thing I will say is all these companies, private sector companies in the world who've made pledges to net zero emissions by 2030. So it's 2023. In about 2 years, they'll all wake up and realize they have a massive problem of having to go buy all these voluntary carbon credits. And if the world is not ready with a regulated system, we really risk exacerbating this carbon cowboy problem. So I hope you'll work on it.
Es una llamada de alerta respecto a la integridad de los mercados de carbono que creo
It's a call to alert, right, that I believe that we all share. Okay, thank you very much for this interesting conversation. Thanks to all of you for your questions, and have a great afternoon and evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alicia and panelists, for that conversation. And thanks to everyone for joining us for the first day of the 26th Third Annual CAF Conference. We trust you enjoyed today's session. We have another very interesting session tomorrow. Before closing the first day, a gently reminder, please return your interpretation headset in the foyer. Sometimes you get to your house and you're like, oh, I have the interpretation set, sorry. Así que por favor, el que tenga el aparato de la interpretación lo puede dejar afuera y no se lo lleve a la casa. Gracias, nos vemos mañana.
Don't take your interpretation headset with you. Thank you. See you tomorrow.
No voy a olvidar esto.